right, and welcome to this special Q&A with director Frank Marshall and producer Nigel Sinclair. My name is Jim Brunzell. I'm the festival director of Sound Unseen, and again, we are so pleased to welcome both these gentlemen in for this special Q&A of their lovely documentary on the Bee Gees. So let's kick things off, gentlemen. And how did you both get involved with working together on this documentary?
I started talking about this almost 3 years ago with Steve Barnett, who runs Capitol Records. We were talking about different projects, and he asked me if I liked the Bee Gees, and I said, well, I've always loved the Bee Gees. Why? He said, well, they had just bought the catalog and they were putting together a 5-year plan of things to sort of reinvigorate the music. And one of the key elements was going to be a documentary, and would I be interested? And of course I said yes. And then, you know, when I was thinking about, so how do I want to do this? I was a big fan of the Beatles doc that Nigel had produced. And so I reached out to Nigel, who I knew from before, and asked him if he wanted to collaborate.
And probably just to complete the triangle, and Frank was working with Mark Monroe, a very distinguished documentary writer, and one of our producers, and I'd worked with Mark on the Beatles, amongst other things. So it just all seemed like serendipity to come together. So we produced that together with the fourth producer, Jeannie Festa, who's my partner.
Okay, and yeah, and you said that it was about 3 years ago that you sort of got interested in making the doc, and that you were a fan of the Bee Gees. Now, I mean, you know, how long during that process are you spent working on this documentary? Like every day, months, weeks? Because obviously you guys are both working on multiple projects and juggling different things. So I just wonder, during that 3 years, you know, how it all sort of comes together.
Well, it started really with meeting Barry. He was coming into town to do the Grammy special, which I think was in 2017.
Yeah.
And so I met him at Capitol Records and we hit it off. And I have to say, it was wonderful meeting him. And I totally understood, you know, that this was going to be a big project, but there was a lot of research that had to go into it, obviously. So that's when Nigel and I started, and Nigel puts together the team that is going to gather everything and do the plan. So I'll let Nigel talk a little bit about how that all came together. And then obviously, as we got more and more things on the table, we spent more and more time together building the film.
Yeah, we part of the time is spent with all these big documentaries where there are artists either alive or their relatives alive. You spend a lot of time on get to know you time. Even though Frank had bonded with Barry, we had 3 or 4 further meetings with him talking about his feelings about the story of the Bee Gees, how it had been presented to the world, and what he was happy about and what he was frustrated about. And we also learnt a perspective from the widows of Maurice and Robert Gibb. And in addition to that, we start doing a lot of research, and the Bee Gees are heavily covered in video as well as audio. There are 5 previous films. So we work our way through that and try and collect as many interesting pieces of footage that have never been seen before or hardly ever been seen, that tell you something you didn't already know. Because our goal here was to find a way to really capture the majesty of the Bee Gees story. I mean, it's a very intricate, long-running 50 years of history story, and to try and capture aspects of it that people really didn't know, which was our goal.
And that involved a couple of trips down to Miami, where, as Nigel said, it's really getting to know the people that we will be talking to in the documentary, mainly Barry. So we We made several trips down to Miami. We also did some scouts to Criterion. We made a couple of trips to London, and really started gathering the materials, because what we really focused on was, because there'd been so much coverage of the Bee Gees over the years, is finding things that nobody had seen before.
Right, and that sort of leans into I guess my next question is, as you mentioned, Nigel, there's been 5 stories, 5 films about the Bee Gees. So I imagine, what were some of the challenges that you both faced in making this documentary, and was it kind of finding new interviews, new footage, new audio recordings? Was that part of it?
Actually, it was they are very well organized, the Bee Gees, and it's surprising how much material there was. And the vast majority of people think the Bee Gees came to life in 1977 with Saturday Night Fever. So bringing to the table stuff from their extraordinary 60s career and their various resurgences allowed us to have a lot of things. So everybody that's seen this film says, I never knew this, I never knew that. I think the challenge for us was to move beyond a sort of television kind of, not there's anything wrong with television, but television perspective, which is this is what happened, to trying to find a way to capture the essence of this family, why this family of 3 brothers had this amazing career, which vastly exceeds most people's knowledge of what they achieved, and how to present that in a film in a way that works and flows. And I'll let Frank comment in a minute, but they had 2 great career arcs. They were as big in the 60s as the Beatles were by 1969, briefly. Then they blew apart because they were 18 and 20 and it was too much. And nobody knows about that. But to tell a story where you have a great peak and then a great valley and then another great peak, it's very difficult to keep people following it emotionally. Frank, if you want.
Yeah, and I think, as I started to talk to various people, it really became clear to me that this was really a story about family. And I come from a musical family, and I have brothers, and I kind of know how that feeling goes. And it's a collaboration that no one else has when they're family. And I think it was the family that kept things together. And so I tried to shape it around that family idea. And one of the perks that we got was, as we started talking to the various family members, we got some 8mm footage from the Miami days that no one had seen before. And that's what you're always hoping for and excited about when you're making a doc, is to get that unknown and unseen footage. So it really evolved around the focus that we were taking and the people that we're meeting to, try and discover how these incredible 5 decades of creativity came to be.
So
right.
Can I pick up? So, I mean, what Frank had us do was go and look at brother bands. And if you look at the history of brother bands, no brother band or sister band has survived extreme fame. I mean, there are some that have survived fame past the age of 30. You can run down the list, the Beach Boys, the Jacksons, the Everly Brothers, and so on. It's actually almost uncanny that you find, oh, here's another one that just blew apart. And these 3 guys, although they had their differences, somehow stayed together for actually until Maurice died in 2003. So we thought, well, there's a way into the story, which is a reveal, something everybody has siblings or is close to people that have siblings. And to bring to the table, what was it about their relationship that meant, unlike all these other people, they kept working together? Of course, we try to answer that in the film.
Yeah, which I think you do. And as Frank said, I mean, there's so much rich history in 5 decades of music. And as you stated, Nigel, I mean, looking at siblings in, bands and having that longevity in their career, I mean, there's very few, far in between, as, again, I can't think of any more off the top of my head than the ones that you mentioned. I mean, maybe Van Halen comes to mind, but there's not many. And, I wonder, as you said, Frank, as well, when you met Barry in 2017 to sort of discuss this, how willing was he to sort of, go back into the family dynamic and his musical career and sort of open up again to allow you to, put his life and family on, in this documentary?
Well, it's a very personal thing to start talking about your family, your brothers, and the sad thing is he's lost all of them. But I do feel like he was ready to talk about it, and the more that we got to know him, the more he opened up to us. And I think that's important. I think he trusted us in trying to tell. He wants the story to be out there of their legacy. And as he says in the film, he's, everybody has their own memories, and he was just giving his memories, but he wanted us to be able to bring his brother's memories into it. And so, it was really important to us to be able to show all the perspectives. And that's why I also felt that the other brothers that we talked to, like Nick Jonas, I mean, they were very forthcoming and very reflective on what it's like, and honest, to be honest, about how it is to work with your brothers.
Yeah. And I imagine, this film is close to 2 hours long, but I imagine you both have some great stories about making this film, or stories that, didn't even end up in the film. And I wonder if there's, maybe one that you each have on this journey of making it, if you could share, a great story that maybe didn't make it into the film.
I've got one.
Sure.
One of the things about great artistic achievement is that we look back on it and we always think, well, they must have planned that. I mean, the Beatles did go into the studio. They did intend to make a masterwork with Sgt. Pepper, and they did make a masterwork. The Bee Gees, on the other hand, on Saturday Night Fever, which is arguably a masterwork, had no intention of doing a soundtrack for that film. In fact, they never read the script. We all probably people think it's the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. Right. They got, as you know from the film, they got a call saying we need some songs for a film that Robert Stigwood, who was their manager, wants, and it was more of a favor to humor the man who'd found and built their career, though they perhaps were beginning to outgrow him. So they somewhat backhandedly sent him 5 songs in a cassette, which is also in the film.
Right.
And we found this guy, Bill Oakes, who was the CEO of the record company. And he told us that in the hotel in New York, in Paris, they were there planning to meet the Bee Gees. And this tape comes in, and Stigwood was in a suite, but he didn't have a CD player. A cassette player. So he listens to this and he said, Robert, you better come down here. And he said, well, bring it up here. And Robert Stigwood was the big guy. So they all sit there listening to these 5 songs, and they were both good enough to realize these were 5 hits. And as you know from the film, they were all those 5 songs that all went to #1. And there was no planning. And actually the Bee Gees only saw the film at the very end. They never had no part in it.
Yeah.
They created the music, and their only contribution was that they thought that the foot noise, dancing, was bearing down on the music, and they made the mixer turn the foot noise down. And yet here we are today, the Bee Gees like Sgt. Pepper, and of course it is a masterwork.
Yeah, I would say that for me, the band members all became like a family, which is what happens in bands that are successful. So there was a second family, and there were a whole lot of stories from all those other band members that we couldn't follow. Some that I really loved, but they didn't fit into the overall structure. And Mark Monroe, rightfully so, was very judicious about, telling the story and keeping the focus on the real family as opposed to the band family. But there's some great road stories from the musicians in the band that maybe, we'll be able to tell somewhere down the road.
Ah, okay. Now,
Some we,
both of you, oh, go ahead.
some we won't be able to tell, but
Yeah. No, and both of you have had long, careers in film, and I wonder what's the challenging part of making a documentary versus like a fiction or narrative film, and how do you balance that? Because I suppose with documentary footage, again, you're pulling archival material, that's fact from papers and magazines and television, radio. But with a fiction film, it's just basically a script, and you have to create that, into something. So I wonder what are some of the, challenges, or what is, the difference, I guess, in making more of like a Hollywood type film versus just like a music biopic.
well, I'll start from the perspective of a director. What I love about docs is you never know what's going to happen every day. Whereas when you're directing a feature, you know exactly what you're doing every day. You get a call sheet that says we're doing this scene, we're doing these lines, here are these actors. And at the end of the day, you have just that specific portion of your film. Whereas in a doc, I would go into the cutting room and we would be working on scenes, and I would say, well, do you have something like that? And they'd show me a bunch of stuff and we'd discover something. It's really, the big difference is discovery, whereas it's a free form in the documentary, and in a feature, it's, exactly what you're gonna have. And I love both, but on a doc, I love those surprises that you discover every day.
I would say that in addition to what Frank just said, they're both difficult in different ways. I mean, goodness knows, they're both difficult tasks. But the task with a documentary, where you're doing something like this, is to find a way to take something that's ultimately fact-based and make it not a journalistic report, but something that has an emotional arc, right, and a trajectory. But at the same time, you're not inventing facts. You can change the story, obviously, with a feature narrative. You can't be untruthful to the facts in a documentary. So looking for underlying truths that actually are truths, and then weaving them through the story so they pay off. Here in our film, it was the relationship between the brothers and the power that brought to the story, including the sad loss of them, and the fact that they were songwriters, as two themes that gave us something that the audience could hang on to as the story unfolded, because there's an awful lot of facts in the Bee Gees story, more than in the Beatles story in a sense, because it goes on for 50 years. And you could get very lost trying to lead you through it. And I think trying to keep the people who are in the story feeling that you haven't been unfair to their story is another challenge that all these films have.
Right. And I suppose in documentary, things can happen any day at any given time as well. So, I mean, I wonder if you maybe consulted with Barry on anything, or if he gave you maybe info or, footage of stuff that maybe you guys didn't have readily available, or, how key was, obviously Barry being the surviving member, has all this knowledge. And I wonder how much of a resource he was when you were, sort of in the process of editing and putting it together.
Well, I'd say, obviously, Barry was always incredibly gracious and humble, and, wanted to let the process of making the film move forward. But he also would send us in different directions, like, introduce us to people. He talked to the rest of the family and made them comfortable with talking to us. He was a great resource for things. And, oftentimes I think Nigel might give him a call and say, do you remember this or whatever? And, he was always very helpful in those areas.
And then Frank and I, and actually our partner Jeannie, made a discovery together. We went to a symposium of audio engineers in New York, which sounds awfully dull. to a layman. I'm sure if you're an audio engineer, it's not. And Albie Galutin and Carl Richardson, who were the engineer and producer of numerous Bee Gees albums, were speaking. And although, they had a good relationship with Barry, they hadn't worked with him for, I'm thinking 30 years at this point, in Albie's case longer. And so all of their memories, which you see in the film come out, were there latently, and they're not really represented in the other Bee Gees documentaries. So we had this dinner with them at which, wine was flowing, and these two started talking about their memories. There was nothing negative. It was literally astounding, including, of course, the famous drum loop story. Yep. But the fact that the Chateau in France, which is the Honky Chateau of Elton John, Honky Chateau album, had been somewhat wrecked when the previous users had left, and had very few modern conveniences, and they were almost like beached refugees there. And because they had this work ethic, they didn't leave, they just worked. Little things like that, and you realize, golly, this is treasure. And so Albie and Carl were a great treasure for us in the film, along with Barry. Probably those people and Bill Oakes told us things that no one had ever said before in the Bee Gees film.
And then we even got, as we interviewed people, we got little clues on where to go as well. Because I've always wondered, one of my big questions for Barry was, where do these songs come from? And, in talking to a lot of different songwriters, you find there's no formula. They just sort of are there and they get picked out of the air. Sometimes they work a long time on them. Sometimes they just happen in 10 minutes. And when we started talking to Chris Martin, he gave us that great perspective that, there's a magic that is running everywhere, and, you don't create it, it just comes to you, and songwriters receive these songs. And that's what Barry was able to articulate about when these songs were happening for the three of them as songwriters, which, was really something we wanted to celebrate.
The other thing that we noticed putting this film together, was that the, let's call them the famous people of great achievement that we contacted. Normally you might get 2 or 3 of these people are available because they've got schedules, and most of the major artists we might work on, most of these musicians like Justin Timberlake, probably have a huge admiration for them. But with the Bee Gees, it was sort of like each of these people felt that they were theirs. They had discovered them. They wanted to tell you how great they were and make sure that you fully appreciate it. You see that with Nick Jonas. You can see it amazingly with Noel Gallagher. You see it with Justin. You see it with Eric Clapton. The range of people who really wanted to be the person to tell the viewer, pay attention to this, these people are amazing, was, of course, as filmmakers, totally joyful for us. And they're all supporting the film as well as it comes out, which is also, unusually strong.
Yeah, and that sort of leads into my last question here. I'm in my 40s and I have such a deep, almost like wonderment now with the Bee Gees after watching the film, and I've started to explore their catalog a bit more deeper now. And I wonder, what do you hope audiences take away from the film, whether if they are familiar with the Bee Gees, if they're, super diehard fans, but, just as even a casual viewer, watching this when it comes out on HBO shortly, what do you hope audiences take away from the film?
Well, for me, I hope it's a celebration of their music, and that you realize what a great gift they had and how deep their creativity was, that it wasn't just a fluke, that, for 5 decades, they gave joy and entertainment and they really crossed over to so many different levels and kept reinventing themselves, that it's extraordinary. And it's not just Saturday Night Fever. There is the songwriting, there is the harmony, there is the creativity, and all of these things, all of these musical gifts that they had. It's a celebration, and that's what we'd like people to remember about the Bee Gees, that they, you know, they weren't just there at this one time.
And I think Frank said that so well. It's hard to cap it, but I would say creativity. That this indeed there is fame and fortune and achievement and excitement, but more than anything else, if you to say what's the quality of these three brothers, it was a natural born creativity, and everything else flowed from that. So it seems to say they were songwriters first could sound like a platitude, but in fact that was their day job. And as we see in the film, when things went awry after Saturday Night Fever, they barely blinked. They just moved off and wrote hits for people. Yep. And hey presto, they have some of the biggest #1 hits with other people. As if this is, I've decided to cross the street, this is my hobby. I think I'll write an album for Barbra Streisand. And that awareness, you sort of realize that just bottled up in their three minds and souls and bodies was this really unusual collaborative creative gift that created this body of work.
Yeah, and the massive impact that they've had on popular music. I mean, you don't realize it until you start saying they wrote that, and it's just incredible. So we're hoping to be able to illuminate that to everybody and to, you know, the world in general. So it's a celebration of the Bee Gees.
Yeah, absolutely. And we here at Sound and Scene love this film. And yes, I do want to thank HBO Documentary Films for allowing us to screen this film. And do you guys want to mention when it's going to play on HBO real quick, and then we'll wrap up?
Go for it.
December the 12th. I was wondering whether it would be cheesy to say that, but Saturday, December the 12th. We're very excited.
Yeah, no,
and
definitely.
If you're watching this internationally, it's coming out all over the world in different formats, depending on whether your countries have cinemas working.
Well, thank you both so much. Producer Nigel Sinclair, director Frank Marshall, the Bee Gees, How Can You Mend a Broken Heart? Thank you guys again so much. It's been a real honor. So thank you.
Thank you, Jim. See you, everybody.
Bye-bye.